Imagine a world in which a single economic war could change the future of two countries. The United States and Canada, two neighbors who have always had close trade relations, suddenly find themselves on the brink of a full-scale conflict. But what happened? Why did Canada have to take steps that could cost the US billions of dollars? In this video, we'll explore how the trade war started by Donald Trump has had unexpected consequences for the US economy and forced Canada to take drastic measures that have made the world take notice.
You giving up your other stuff? I mean, how are you running your other businesses?
With great difficulty. Yeah, I mean...
But there's no turning back, you're saying?
I'm just here trying to make government more efficient.
It all started when Trump, as part of his America First policy, imposed a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum coming from Canada. What he didn't realize was that these measures would have devastating effects on the US economy. The Canadian government, under the leadership of new Prime Minister Mark Carney and Ontario Premier Doug Ford, decided not to stay in the shadows. Instead of remaining silent and accommodating, as Mexico had done, Canada decided to respond forcefully. What was the result of this bold strategy? The answer is a 25% tariff on electricity exports to the US, which hurt states like New York, Michigan, and Minnesota. These measures not only alarmed American economists, but also caused anxiety among large corporations and businessmen who began to warn of a possible economic disaster. The confrontation between the two countries was gaining momentum, and no one could predict how it would end.
We'll tell you why Woz is correct in having that take, because look, as a reminder, Musk is the CEO of multiple companies, not just Tesla, but also he's the CEO of SpaceX and CTO of X. He's not the CEO, but CTO of X. So today we're going to focus on Tesla specifically because, well, take a look at this. This chart will show you Tesla's not doing so well. The stock for Tesla has taken a dip, to say the least.
But it wasn't just an economic game. Canada's response to Trump has become a real political statement. Prime Minister Carney said that Canada can no longer trust the US and has an obligation to protect its citizens. These words mark the beginning of a new phase in the relationship between the two countries. Since then, Canada has not just resisted, but has employed active countermeasures that could have a decisive impact on the US and its economy. The stakes are getting higher. Economists warn that if this war continues, both the US and Canada could face serious consequences that will affect not only their own economies, but also the global marketplace. The world's leading companies are already worried about the effects on their supplies, and statistics and data from international organizations point to serious risks for both countries. What will happen next? Will Trump continue his aggressive trade policy, or will he be forced to give in? How far can this war go? Will Canada be able to get respect and fairness, or will it face even harsher economic measures? We'll get to the bottom of these questions and show how all these events could change the world order. Get ready for startling revelations that will make you look at the trade war in a whole new way.
30% over the last week. So this is the 6-month performance chart for Tesla stock. And as you can see, it went up like crazy in the weeks after Trump got elected, peaking at almost $500 per share in mid-December. But since then, it's been tumbling. And as of writing this, Tesla's stock sits at $225 a share. So that's still pretty pricey per share, but it's not $500 per share. Like, obviously, he's struggling here. So in fact, yesterday was the single worst day for Tesla stock in 5 years. It went down a whole 15%. That also, by the way, reduced Musk's net worth by...
The trade war between the US and Canada is not just a political conflict. It's a clash between two economies with deep interdependencies that now appear to be collapsing. It all started when US President Donald Trump, in an effort to restore America's great trading power, announced a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imports from China, but also extended these measures to Canada his closest ally. This decision shook up the entire international economy and put Canada in an extremely difficult position. Steel and aluminum are not just metals, they are vital components for many industries, from construction to automobile manufacturing, and Canada was one of the largest suppliers of these materials to the United States. In response to aggressive US actions, Canadian authorities, under the leadership of new Prime Minister Mark Carney, decided to act decisively.
The car that I drive is the Model S Class
Which is that one?
that red one in the middle.
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that.
It's 0 to 60 miles an hour in 2 seconds. It's faster than a Ferrari.
It's pretty. I don't know if my people can handle it. They're going to be using it more. I'm not allowed to use it. This is beautiful. Whoa! Should I get in?
Get in!
Okay.
Have you ever sat
Let me get in
steering wheel on one of these? Of a Tesla?
You want my notes?
Yeah.
They gave me notes. I said, I'm not Biden. I don't need notes. This is a different panel than I've had. Everything's computer. That's beautiful. Wow.
Immediately after the US authorities announced the tariffs, Canada began taking steps to protect its interests. Carney, who even before his position in the Prime Ministry was active in international financial circles, realized that to remain silent in such a situation means to risk not only the economy, but also future relations with the United States. Thus, it was decided to introduce retaliatory measures aimed not only at restoring economic balance, but also at protecting jobs in Canada, which were directly dependent on trade with the United States. One of the first steps was to impose a 25% tariff on electricity exports to the US. This measure was particularly important because the North American grid was heavily dependent on electricity coming from Canada, especially in states such as New York, Michigan, and Minnesota. These regions relied heavily on cheap Canadian energy to supply their industries and populations.
A burning of a store. So you could probably stop people from protesting, but you're not going to stop people from vandalizing by, some excessive show of force. And, I think folks need to understand that
the electrical grids of these states became gridlocked and electricity costs rose significantly. This, in turn, set off a chain reaction. Higher energy prices drove up the cost of goods, making life difficult not only for businessmen, but also for ordinary Americans who had to face higher prices for everyday goods. About a month after the new Canadian electricity rates were implemented, New York, Michigan, and Minnesota experienced massive increases in utility rates. Industries running on Canadian electricity began to reduce production capacity, causing additional economic heat. However, this was not enough for Trump to realize the seriousness of the situation. Canadian authorities were forced to take even tougher measures. Prime Minister Carney and Ontario Premier Doug Ford, inspired by the successes in negotiations with the European Union, decided not to limit themselves only to electricity tariffs. They began imposing additional duties on imports of American goods, which included not only steel and aluminum, but also various agricultural products, in particular soybeans, corn, and other crops from the United States. These measures hit American farmers hard, and not even a month later, reports began to appear on Trump's desk about the losses suffered by the US agricultural industry due to Canada's retaliatory actions.
The Tesla stock price and all of that stuff, like, folks gotta understand the nature of that stock price has always been overinflated. Like, how do you become the richest man in the world? By just selling cars. Like, Toyota's not the richest company in the world. They sell way more Teslas than Elon does. That's because Elon's stock price is pegged to just people's belief that he's gonna turn Tesla into more than just a car company, right? Like, oh, it's gonna be self-driving, it's gonna be this, it's gonna be self-taxiing. You're gonna be able to rent your Teslas. Like, he's always selling some grander vision that usually doesn't come to fruition, and that's what the stock price is indicative of. That's not to say he didn't turn Tesla into a profitable company. It is, but like, the profits made off of the cars that this guy sells.
At the same time, the escalating trade war began to impact financial markets. Long-term investors began to seriously worry about further consequences for the US economy. Canada, for its part, actively used this to its advantage. Focusing on strengthening trade ties with Europe, Asia, and Latin America, it began pushing its goods into new markets in an attempt to reduce dependence on US imports and exports. Canada made no secret of its ambitions to become a strong and independent player on the world stage, able to contain US pressure. This led to unexpected consequences. Companies focused on the Canadian market began to develop production in Europe and Asia, which also undermined the economic situation in the United States. In fact, large corporations such as General Motors, Ford, and Tesla, which were dependent on Canadian supplies, began to consider moving production to other regions to avoid rising costs. The rising cost of manufacturing in the US also made cars made in the US significantly more expensive, hitting demand in the domestic market. In addition, US businesses, accustomed to free or cheap access to Canadian resources, now found themselves in a situation where their costs rose and their profits began to decline. The Canadian authorities demonstrated not only firmness but also strategic thinking. Instead of remaining a passive player in the US trade arena, Canada began actively maneuvering in the international arena, forging ties with other major players. This gave it a unique opportunity to balance its economy and avoid total destruction. For the US, however, this meant only one thing: it now had to contend, not only with Canada, but also with other major world players who began to look at its country prone to trade manipulation and aggression. In response, talk began in the US about possible economic isolation of the country, further exacerbating the crisis. Over time, statistics show that Canada began to win this economic battle. In 2019, despite Trump's threats and pressure from the US, the Canadian economy showed steady growth and trade relations with Europe and Asia strengthened significantly. The confrontation with America has led to Canada being perceived as an independent and strong partner capable of defending its interests on the world stage. All this shows that the trade war between the US and Canada is not just a coincidence. It is a whole process involving millions of people, many companies and countries whose interests are intertwined on the international stage. And despite initial aggression from the US, Canada has demonstrated that it is willing to fight for its economic and political interests without giving them up without a fight. Canada's situation since Trump launched his trade war has changed dramatically. Previously, for a long time, Canada played the role of a silent ally of the US, maintaining economic and political ties without too much interference. But when the steel and aluminum tariffs imposed by the US began to threaten not only the national economy but also jobs, things changed. New Prime Minister Mark Carney, who came to power with a clear vision for Canada in global politics, became a key figure in this economic struggle. Carney, a man with a reputation as a tough economist and strategist, immediately realized that the silence and diplomacy that Mexico had used was no longer appropriate. Mexico, like Canada, came under pressure from Trump, but its response was much more restrained. President López Obrador focused on quiet negotiations, on low-profile agreements, avoiding open conflict. This approach allowed Mexico to maintain a somewhat stable relationship with the US and minimize damage without engaging in direct confrontation. As events unfolded, however, Carney concluded that such a strategy would be disastrous for Canada. It was obvious to Carney that if Canada remained a silent ally, America would continue to worsen the terms of trade and show disregard for its interests. He took the decisive step of choosing the path of open confrontation, which came as a surprise to the US. With his decision, he not only took responsibility for protecting the interests of the Canadian people, but also catalyzed a change in international politics. He stated that we will not allow anyone, much less the US, to dictate terms to us. If necessary, we will fight for every job, every market position, every right. These words quickly spread across the international news, and the entire political elite, from Europe to Asia, began to watch how the situation would unfold. Carney and his government put Canada in a position where its actions no longer depended on the will of the United States. They began imposing additional sanctions and raising tariffs on key US goods. Unlike Mexico, where many decisions remained hidden from the general public, Canada opted for a public strategy. When Trump continued to impose new restrictions and tariffs, Canada responded with reciprocal measures that immediately impacted the US market. Canadian goods, which make up a significant portion of US imports, began to face serious tariffs. But more significantly, Canada accelerated the development of other trade routes with Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Particular attention was paid to expanding trade with the European Union. Canadian manufacturers, knowing that US sanctions would hit their profits hard, began looking for new channels for their goods, and the European market proved to be an ideal opportunity. This new trade strategy allowed Canada to not only compensate for the losses from the US, but also significantly strengthen its position on the world stage. Canada was soon able to ship high-tech products, agricultural products, and energy to the EU, which had an immediate impact on economic growth. When Carney and his team began to raise economic ties with new regions, Mexico stayed on the sidelines, hesitant to engage in open economic wars with the US. Its approach remained diplomatic, and while, as we know, Mexico continued to exist within a framework of economic stability with the US, this did not allow it to strengthen its economic position as much as Canada. Still, Carney's strategic move was not without risks. Of course, the US responded harshly, but it was a necessary step for Canada to regain respect and esteem on the world stage. Unlike Mexico, which chose to shy away from open conflict, Carney said Canada needed to show its strength and independence. His position was simple and clear: if we remain silent, we will be ignored. This statement shook the world market, and Carney himself became a symbol of a new approach to international politics, one that prioritized not only economics but also national dignity. The advantage of open confrontation was that it allowed Canada to build a more independent foreign policy, which attracted the attention of other countries such as Japan and South Korea, which began renegotiating their economic agreements with the US to avoid further trade shocks. Canada's response to the trade war, as well as its retaliation, contrasted sharply with Mexico's tactics. Mexico continued to stand its ground, but in the shadows, while Canada began to actively campaign for its independence, which significantly changed the international perception of the country. This became an important moment in diplomatic and economic relations, and as events unfolded, other countries began to watch how Canada would deal with the challenges that Trump presented. It is believed that such drastic measures taken by Carney were part of his long-term strategy to strengthen Canada's position as an independent player on the international stage. Unlike Mexico, which continued to negotiate covertly, Canada charted its own path of open resistance and diplomatic pressure. In a short time, Carney and his team were able to convince numerous countries that Canada was capable of not only negotiating, but also defending its interests on the world stage. This was an important step to strengthen the national economy and position in international politics. When the trade war between Canada and the US escalated, the effects began to be felt not only at the level of the two countries, but also in global markets. Canada's retaliatory measures hit the US economy hard, and it was obvious that the US authorities could not ignore the economic damage caused by aggressive trade policies. Increased tariffs on Canadian goods, such as steel, aluminum, and agricultural products caused tremendous discomfort among US manufacturers, and that was just the beginning. At first, the damage was almost imperceptible, small fluctuations in stock markets and price increases in some commodities. But as time went on, the situation began to deteriorate. For example, industries in states like New York, Michigan, and Minnesota depended on cheap Canadian energy. As electricity rates increased, utility prices in these states skyrocketed, driving up production costs and making it difficult for many large businesses to operate. US automobile manufacturing companies, such as General Motors and Ford, began reporting rising production costs, as well as a slowdown in production due to rising aluminum and steel prices. The tariffs imposed by Canada proved painful for everyone connected to Canadian supplies. Over time, economists and business analysts began to warn that if this situation continued, the US could face a full economic crisis. It was estimated that if tariffs continued to rise, the US economy could suffer damage of up to 3% of GDP, leading to lower living standards and higher unemployment. Despite these warnings, however, the Trump administration was not ready to back down. It became increasingly aggressive in its fight with Canada, and some economists began talking about the possible onset of a new Great Depression if the trade war continued. But the most shocking move was Trump's announcement to impose a 50% tariff on all Canadian goods. This decision was the culmination of the entire trade war, and it was seen as almost a rejection of diplomacy. The US demanded that Canada become the 51st state or all of these tariffs would not be lifted. This threat caused a storm of indignation among Canadians, and the Carney government immediately rejected such demands. Canada is not for sale, Carney said in a public speech that became one of the most resonant statements of his political career. He said the Canadian people and government would fight for their independence and their right to free trade, defying US ultimatums. The reaction to these actions was twofold. On the one hand, a real economic storm began to unfold in the US. Tariffs on Canadian goods, especially energy, significantly increased the cost of raw materials for US manufacturers, and this led to higher prices for cars, houses, and building materials. Fears of a possible recession became a reality when the real estate market and the stock market began to show sharp declines. Shares of major US companies such as General Motors, Ford, and Tesla fell 3 to 5% in just 1 week after the new tariffs were announced. The auto industry, which depends on Canadian supplies of components and raw materials, was particularly hard hit. At the same time, the business community, which had long supported Trump's policies, began to express increasingly open discontent. A growing number of large corporations, such as Amazon and Walmart, have begun to oppose aggressive trade with Canada, warning that such moves would raise the price of goods and erode Americans' purchasing power. Investors, worried about instability in the markets, began to withdraw their capital en masse, and by the end of the second quarter of 2025, the S&P 500 index fell by 2.1%, and the US dollar weakened by 4.3% against the Canadian dollar. In contrast, the situation in Canada has stabilized. Although the trade war with the US hurt the Canadian economy, the country has begun to adapt quickly to the new environment. Canadian companies, which had been hit hard by trade restrictions with the US, began to look for new markets. Existing agreements with the European Union began to open new horizons for Canadian exports. Among other things, much of Canada's agriculture and oil industries were able to find more favorable terms in Europe and Asia. Canada soon signed several important trade agreements with countries such as Japan and South Korea, greatly reducing dependence on the United States. The Carney government also began to expand economic ties with Latin America, which improved Canada's position in the global economy. The tariffs on US goods that Canada imposed in response to aggressive US policies continued to produce some results. In particular, agricultural products and automotive components previously shipped to the US began to flow to other countries, allowing Canada to mitigate the economic losses from the trade war. Canadian farmers, for example, began exporting their products to Europe and Asia, which helped offset the loss of sales in the US. Meanwhile, in the US, the situation was becoming increasingly difficult. Despite Trump's tough trade policies, he couldn't help but notice that his policies were increasingly isolating the country from its allies. Constant threats and ultimatums, such as the demand to join the US or face tougher sanctions, were creating tensions not only among politicians but also among big business and the population. In response to this aggression, the US began to lose not only support from Canada, but also from other key economic players on the world stage. There was a sense that America, in trying to strengthen its economy at the expense of other countries, was ultimately destroying its own. Canada, for its part, showed its resilience and determination to defend its economic interests, and these actions became the basis for a new wave of international relations. The no-concession strategy led to the strengthening of Canada's position as an independent economic player capable of putting pressure on powerful countries such as the United States. As a result of this trade conflict, Canada was not only able to protect itself from economic losses, but also brought its country to a new level of influence on the world stage.